Hello and welcome to the first ever Boxing Features mini documentary. In this video I'm going to be celebrating the amazing career of promoter Frank Warren as it's approaching 40 years since his first ever professional boxing show licensed by the British Boxing Board of Control. Before I go any further, I could have made at least 10 videos on Frank Warren's career, which just goes to show how much he has done in and around the sport. So I've chose to talk about what I think is the most interesting and the most relevant parts of Frank Warren's career. Frank Warren was born on the 28th of February 1952 and grew up in the Priory Green estate in Islington. Growing up, Frank was always clever and passed his 11 plus, which allowed him to attend grammar school, but admitted himself that he stopped engaging with his education and simply stopped going to school at around 14 years of age. Frank then trained to become a solicitor's clerk, but again he soon realised that a 9-to-5 job wasn't what he wanted. Heading into his early 20s, Frank became involved in pubs and clubs with his uncle Bob, and they had a machine business putting in pool tables and fruit machine into public houses. Then in May of 1977, Frank went to a club called Sinatra's in Croydon, along with his uncle Bob and some other family members, to see his second cousin, the Governor Lenny McLean, fight former professional boxer and all-round hard man Roy Shaw in an unlicensed boxing match. Lenny was knocked out in the first round, so Frank and his uncle went backstage to see how Lenny was, and Bob told Lenny to go and see Freddie Hill, who was a top trainer at the time, training the Finnegan brothers. So then, Lenny trained with him and trained hard in preparation for the rematch with Roy Shaw. But when the fight came around, Freddie was unable to be in Lenny's corner because he was licensed by the British Boxing Board of Control, so he asked Frank and his uncle Bob to be in his corner, and Lenny brutally knocked out Roy Shaw. So after the two fights, there needed to be a trilogy fight. So Lenny, along with Frank and Bob, went to see Joe Parr and Alex Dean, who were involved in putting on the fights. But Lenny felt he weren't going to get paid enough for the rubber match. So a young Frank Warren stepped in and said, "We'll do it." And just like that, Frank Warren became Lenny McLean's promoter. Frank was not able to make the Roy Shaw fight straight away, so Frank put on his first show at the Rainbow Theatre in Finsbury Park, putting Lenny up against a doorman from Ilford. Lenny was successful that night and made a decent amount of money, so Frank carried on promoting his shows with mixed results, including beating Roy Shaw once more. So Frank's status as an unlicensed boxing promoter was growing quickly, so he started the National Boxing Council to rival the British Board, and it had relative success. However, Frank decided he wanted to get a British Boxing Board of Control licence a couple of years later, and the board were happy to have him on their side. Frank knew his work was cut out for him in the professional game, as Mickey Duff and the rest of a group of promoters known as the Cartel had boxing locked up in many ways, with exclusivity on the big venues, the TV deals, and many of the great fighters. But as we know now, that didn't deter Frank, and he put on his first show at the Bloomsbury Crest Hotel on the 1st of December 1980. Frank brought over light heavyweights Jerry Martin and Otis Gordon over from America, with Martin stopping Gordon in the 7th. But the show flopped massively, with hardly any tickets being sold, but Frank pushed on, putting on shows over the next couple of years at venues like the York Hall and Regent Crest Hotel, with the shows gradually building in popularity. However, Frank still couldn't get any of his fights on TV because there were only two broadcasters at the time, the BBC, who were exclusively with the Cartel, and ITV, who only aired the big overseas fights. But when Frank won a purse bid for Clinton McKenzie versus Steve Early for the British Super Lightweight title, he managed to break the mould by having the fight televised on the BBC, which was a huge step for Frank Warren in the game. And on the undercard featured one of Frank's very first signings, a great welterweight prospect called Terry Marsh, who would later play a huge part in Frank Warren's story. Frank eventually managed to get a TV deal with ITV and then signed a plethora of young talent, as well as bringing back big name heavyweight Joe Bugner after his loss to Ernie Shavers, and he hadn't fought in the UK for over 6 years, so at the time this was a very big deal. Over the next few years, working through the mid-80s, Frank's shows only got bigger, and therefore the level of fights only got bigger, with some notable fights including Sochi Dalada beating Charlie Magri for the WBC flyweight title at Alexandra Palace, Donald Curry beating Colin Jones for the WBA and IBF welterweight title at the National Exhibition Centre in Birmingham, and Dennis Andrews beating JB Williamson at Pickett's Lock Stadium for the WBC light heavyweight title. Then on Wednesday, the 4th of March 1987, Frank produced his first ever homegrown world champion in the aforementioned Terry Marsh, a fireman from Basildon, Essex, when he beat the IBF champion Joe Manley in a circus tent in Basildon. Warren's next show was his first at the Royal Albert Hall, which featured Sammy Reeson getting a decision over Manfred Yasman. Moving into the late 80s, Frank became involved in the building of the London Arena in Millwall that could seat up to 12,500 people. The first boxing show there had Carlos de Leon beating Sammy Reeson for the WBC Cruiserweight title on the 17th of May 1989. However, the end of Frank's first decade in boxing didn't go exactly to plan. On the 30th of November 1989, outside the Broadway Theatre in Barking, Frank Warren was shot by a masked shooter in the chest. Frank was rushed to hospital by a police van due to an ambulance strike at the time, where his family were told the bullet had missed his heart by an inch and that he may not even make it through the night. But thankfully he did, although he did lose half a lung, and 10 days later, Frank eventually discharged himself against hospital orders. Now, the burning question was who did shoot Frank Warren. At the time, the newspapers were coming out with all sorts of outlandish story, but 2 months later, after flying in from the US, Warren's first ever world champion Terry Marsh was arrested at Gatwick Airport and was held in question for the shooting of Warren. You see, after Marsh had won the world title, he signed a new big money contract. However, Marsh was only able to defend his title once before retiring due to being diagnosed with epilepsy, which marked the end of Frank Warren and Terry Marsh's relationship. There was no motive for Marsh to have shot Warren, not made known to the public, even if there was one. However, Marsh was held in prison awaiting trial for 10 months. When the trial arrived, a man called Peter Harris had come forward to testify against Marsh, claiming that the former world champion had admitted to him that he'd shot Frank Warren. Harris was an inmate at Wormwood Scrubs awaiting trial for drug and handling charges. He was a repeated offender and a known criminal to the justice system. He claimed that when Marsh had arrived, he'd befriended him, and one day during an exercise period, he claimed that Marsh had proceeded to tell him that he shot the legendary promoter. However, the judge ridiculed Harris's statement, saying he was just trying to get a shortened sentence, and revealed that Harris wasn't even his real name, and therefore the jury had to treat this evidence with extreme caution. But before being taken back down, Harris stated, "Criminal, yes. Liar, no." The jury were also told to be wary of 2 witnesses who said the shooter vaguely resembled the build of Terry Marsh. After what was probably the worst 10 months of Marsh's life, Marsh was found not guilty for the shooting of Frank Warren. Almost 31 years ago to the day, no one has been convicted for the shooting. However, today Warren insists that he does know who shot him, but stated he will never reveal who it was. Moving into the 90s, Frank began working with some of the biggest names in boxing and signed a young bantamweight from Sheffield from Yemeni descent called Nazim Hamed. Frank knew straight away that Naz was special and knew that he had the potential to tap into a completely new market with the way he boxed and presented himself in such a brash way. Warren persuaded ITV to have him main eventing a show, and from then Naz was on his way to becoming a superstar, and he won the European title also in 1994. 1995 was a mega year for Frank Warren, putting on some of the most iconic fights in British boxing history. On Saturday the 25th of February, Frank worked with Don King to make WBC super middleweight champion and British boxing legend Nigel Benn take on one of the most feared men in boxing, the mini Mike Tyson, Gerald McLennan, in one of the most exciting fights that ended in tragedy when, after being counted out, McLennan collapsed and had a blood clot on his brain and become severely brain damaged, and to this day has no eyesight, suffers from short-term memory loss and limited walking ability. Then on the 2nd of September, also in a co-promotion with Don King, after 3 failed attempts, Frank Bruno finally became the heavyweight champion of the world by beating Oliver McCall for the WBC strap at Wembley Stadium. Then 28 days later, the Prince was crowned when Frank's golden boy Nazim Hamid became the youngest ever British world champion by beating Steve Robinson for the WBO featherweight title, although the WBO strap wasn't recognised as a major world title and wouldn't be for another 9 years. Also in 1995, Frank left ITV and signed a big new deal with Sky, which led to the first ever Sky box office pay-per-view in 1996, when Frank Bruno made his first defence of his world title against Mike Tyson 7 years on from when they first fought, and it marked the end of Bruno's career when he was brutally knocked out in the third round in Vegas. In early 1997, 19-0 24-year-old Welsh super middleweight Joe Calzaghe made a permanent move to Frank Warren, which subsequently led him to getting his hands on the WBO title after beating an ageing yet still game Chris Eubanks in the October. Just before this, a young Ricky Hatton had made his pro debut at Kingsway Leisure Centre on the undercard of Robin Reed retaining his world title against Hakeem Sharif. But probably the climax of the 90s for Frank and one of the high points in his whole career came on the 19th of December 1997, taking Naz to New York in an all-out war against Kevin Kelly at Madison Square Garden, in what was then the highest grossing featherweight boxing event ever to be held at the Garden. But moving into 1998, there were cracks in the relationship between Frank and Naz, with Frank becoming frustrated with Naz's often poor relationship with Naz's long-term trainer and mentor Brendan Ingle, and Naz's increasing entourage, which often come with superstardom. This eventually resulted in Frank walking away from Naz after his defence against Wayne McCullough in Atlantic City. It was no doubt a huge decision for Frank, as he'd arguably just lost one of the biggest stars in British boxing. But at the turn of the millennium, Frank worked with one of the biggest stars in world boxing, bringing Mike Tyson over to the UK, knocking out Julius Francis in Manchester and Lou Savarese in Scotland. However, Frank claimed the second show in Scotland didn't go as smoothly as he'd liked, with stories coming out in the newspaper that Tyson had done some damage to Warren, which the promoter denies. However, he has said that strong words were exchanged and it was the last time Tyson was brought over to the UK. However, Frank's dealings with the heavyweight big guns continued when he made Lennox Lewis against Franz Botha at the London Arena, with the Lion getting a second round stoppage. Frank's journey with Ricky Hatton was becoming prominent throughout the early noughties, with the Mancunian regularly selling out the MEN defending his WBU title. Joe Calzaghe also continued his undefeated run defending his WBO title. In 2005, Frank signed Olympic silver medalist Amir Khan, who made his debut in Bolton later that year, but 2005 is known for a huge fight, a momentous occasion in Manchester where Ricky Hatton dethroned IBF super lightweight champion and pound-for-pound star Costa Tszyu on the 4th of June. Then nearly a year later, on the 4th of March 2006, at the same arena, Joe Calzaghe unified the super middleweight division, adding the IBF to his WBO title, convincingly beating heavy favourite Jeff Lacey. Then the next year, Frank made Calzaghe up against another undefeated world champion in Mikkel Kessler, this time for the WBC, WBA and WBO Super Middleweight World Championship at the Millennium Stadium, and the Brit got a decision at the end of 12 brutal rounds in a fantastic fight. It was the perfect start for Frank Warren in 2008 as he got inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame, which is a tremendous achievement for anyone to be inducted into such a prestigious honour roll. Then on the 8th of March 2008, Frank promoted David Haye versus Enzo Maccarinelli, champion versus champion, all British cruiserweight unification fight at the O2 Arena, London, where David Haye finished the WBO champ inside 2 rounds, which was Haye's last fight at cruiser before moving up to heavyweight. A month after this, there was another huge fight with Frank co-promoting Calzaghe versus Bernard Hopkins with Golden Boy in Las Vegas, where Calzaghe won a split decision and moved to 45-0. However, this was the last time Frank and Joe worked together. Calzaghe and Frank then engaged in a fierce legal battle in 2009, with Calzaghe claiming that Warren owed him just under £2 million for unpaid fees, and then Frank claimed he was owed around £1 million for breaking his contract over Joe's last fight with Roy Jones Jr. Warren brought in experienced barrister Ronald Eighties to argue Frank Warren's case. However, it didn't help him in the end, as in March of 2009, Calzaghe won the case and subsequently caused Warren's Sports Network Limited to go into administration. Also around this time, Frank signed Team GB Olympic gold medalist from 2008, James DeGale, and Frank's 2004 medalist, Khan, won the WBA super lightweight title in the July. Frank's first show of the new decade took place on the 13th of February 2010, which featured 30-0 lightweight Kevin Mitchell knocking out Mendoza, which led to a big show at Mitchell's football team West Ham Stadium, Upton Park, 3 months later in a losing effort against Michael Katsidis. On the 21st of May 2011, Frank put 2 British prospects who would both go on to win world titles in a fantastic British and Commonwealth title fight between the 2008 Olympic gold medalist James DeGale and George Groves, with Groves getting a razor-thin decision at the end of the night. In mid-2011, Frank Warren left Sky and started his own new boxing channel with a company called Boxing Channel Media. They called it BoxNation and got the rights to archive footage from the 60s, 70s and 80s with loads of legendary fighters. Then on the 30th of September 2011, BoxNation aired their first live show at the York Hall with Liam Walsh stopping Paul Appleby. And then a month later, a big fight for the WBO light heavyweight title between Nathan Cleverly and Tony Bellew, which was an absolute war, with Cleverly getting the decision in the end. On the 1st of December 2011, BoxNation became a subscription channel and continued to show great fights. And then on the 14th of July 2012, Frank returned to Upton Park, that this time with the much anticipated heavyweight fight between David Haye and Derek Chisora, which was huge for BoxNation due to that absolute volatile build-up, and Haye impressed with a great knockout in the 5th round. Throughout the mid-2010s, Frank and BoxNation showed amazing fights with the likes of Billy Joe Saunders, Chris Eubank Jr., Tyson Fury, just to name a few. Frank's channel also aired hundreds of live overseas fights, including numerous pound-for-pound stars like Floyd Mayweather, Canelo Alvarez and Vasily Lomachenko. It was then announced at the end of 2016 that BoxNation would team up with BT Sports in a deal that would show 20 fights on BT Sports and then an additional 10 fights on BoxNation alongside 30 international fights. This deal meant that BoxNation would be added to the BT Sport package, and the deal offered Warren, BT, EE and BoxNation to work collectively in further expanding boxing's already growing popularity in the UK. This deal was extended in 2018 with more fights being shown on BT Sports. It was also the year that Frank signed Tyson Fury and brought him back from his darkest days after the Klitschko fight and led him to the top once again. But 2018 was also the year of Frank Warren and Josh Warrington promoting the Leeds man to winning the IBF featherweight world title at Ellen Road against Lee Selby, and then to defend his title in Manchester in an all-time classic against Carl Frampton. Last year, Warren worked with Bob Arum in introducing Tyson Fury to America with 2 great Vegas nights, one in June against Tom Schwartz and one in September against Otto Wallin, and earlier this year, as well as working with Tyson Fury in the Gypsy King's demolition of Wilder in the rematch. Although it was a top-ranking PBC show, Frank also was the first promoter to bring boxing back to the UK after all boxing was stopped due to the coronavirus, with Brad Foster beating James Beach Jr. for the British and Commonwealth bantamweight title on the 10th of July 2020 at the BT studios behind closed doors. That brings us to the present, nearly 40 years to the day since Frank Warren promoted that first professional show at the Bloomsbury Crest Hotel, and the legendary promoter has well and truly cemented his legacy as one of the greatest promoters of all time, known for building up countless prospects and taking them to world honours and above. He has now made Queensberry Promotions a family business, with sons George, Francis and Henry all working for him alongside Frank's brothers and nephews. To celebrate this amazing anniversary, Frank Warren has done it again. He's made one of the best fights in heavyweight boxing between two undefeated British boxers in the devastating young prospect Daniel Dubois versus the 2016 Olympic silver medalist Joe Joyce, 15-0 versus 11-0, live on BT Sports. And then next week comes full circle, returning to the same division he started with a light heavyweight fight, a domestic showdown between Anthony Yard and Lyndon Arthur. And the only shame is that both of these fights won't have a crowd, but that is testament to Frank for still making these happen. Thanks for watching this Boxing Features mini documentary. Make sure you like, share and subscribe. Get me on all the social medias. I'll be doing live videos and Q&A session. And all that's left to say is congratulations to Frank Warren for 40 years in the business, and thank you for the boxing.